Dawn mist clings to alpine pastures above 1,400 meters in Romania's Carpathian highlands, a landscape where shepherds have grazed flocks for centuries and where something has changed. In recent years, the predators have stopped retreating. The bears that once kept to the deep timber, the ones that fled at the sound of dogs or the crack of a staff against rock, have begun pressing closer. And they are hungry. These ridgelines have shaped a way of life older than the country that claims them. Shepherds move their flocks along the same seasonal routes their grandfathers walked, through meadows thick with wild grasses that thin to bare scree near the peaks. The Carpathians arc across Romania like a spine, and within their forests lives the largest population of brown bears in Europe, over 8,000 individuals, more than any other nation on the continent. For generations, the arrangement held: bears in the deep valleys, sheep on the open slopes, and enough distance between them to keep the peace. That distance has been closing. Deforestation has carved into the corridors bears depend on. Illegal logging operations have stripped sections of old-growth forest that once buffered wild territory from grazing land. And in recent seasons, reduced beech mast yields, the nuts that form a critical autumn food source, have left bears entering the colder months underfed and desperate. When the forest no longer provides, the animals go where the calories are. They go to the sheep. In a small commune in Harghita County, nestled against the eastern arc of the mountains, a shepherd in his 50s had watched this shift unfold across decades of work on the high pastures. He was not a man unfamiliar with bears. He had tended sheep across these ridgelines since he was young.
But before we get into the political deadlock and what Romania's parliament actually did next, if this kind of detailed, research-driven breakdown is something you value, I'd ask you to consider hitting subscribe. This channel exists to tell these stories properly: the forensics, the environmental context, the policy failures. Not as clickbait, but as accounts these people deserve. A like helps more viewers find this work. Now, back to Bucharest and the emergency culling quotas that followed. Learned the terrain the way only someone who sleeps beside his flock through summer storms can learn it. He knew the signs: tracks in soft ground near the enclosure, tufts of wool caught on fence posts, the nervous circling of the dogs before nightfall. He understood what a bear's presence meant, and he understood what it cost. But the bear that had fixed itself on his flock was different from the others. An adult male, estimated at 250 kilograms, had been raiding the sheepfold repeatedly over the preceding weeks. It came after dark. It took lambs. The livestock guardian dogs, large, powerful animals bred specifically for this work, raised alarm each time. But the bear was not deterred. It had learned the pattern. It knew the dogs would bark, but not close the distance against something that size. Night after night, it returned with increasing confidence. And night after night, the shepherd lost animals he could not afford to replace. He did what the system told him to do. He reported the predation to local authorities. He filed the paperwork. He asked for intervention. Under Romania's strict protected species legislation, brown bears had been relisted as a protected species after a brief 2016 culling exception was allowed to lapse. The legal framework that governed these animals was built in Brussels and Bucharest, not on the mountain. It prioritized population conservation over individual threat removal, and it moved slowly. The shepherd's request for a removal permit entered a bureaucratic process that would not produce an answer in time. No permit was issued. And so the man found himself caught in a position that no legislation had been written to address. Not honestly, not practically. He was bound to the mountain by tradition, by economics, by the simple fact that his flock was his livelihood and he could not abandon it. The bear was bound to the flock by hunger and by the learned knowledge that food was there for the taking. Between them stood a fence, a handful of dogs,
and a legal system that had offered the shepherd nothing but silence. The permit never came. The bear kept returning.
And the shepherd, armed with nothing but a staff and his own experience, decided he would drive the animal off himself, the way he had done in previous seasons with smaller, more cautious bears. This one was neither small nor cautious. He had done everything within his power. He had reported the predation to local authorities. He had kept the guardian dogs close to the enclosure. He had stayed on the mountain because leaving meant losing the flock. And losing the flock meant losing everything he had built across 30 years of highland shepherding. The 250-kilogram male had taken lambs on multiple nights now, each raid bolder than the last. And on this night, it came back again. Darkness settled over the Carpathian ridge sometime after 9. The temperature dropped. Mist threaded through the tree line 100 meters above the sheepfold, and somewhere inside that mist, the bear was moving. It descended along a route it already knew, past the same broken slope, through the same gap in the beech canopy, drawn by the scent of penned animals and the memory of easy feeding. The sheep stirred first. A low collective unease rippled through the flock before any dog had barked, the animals pressing against one another in the enclosure as if the air itself carried warning. Then the dogs caught it. The livestock guardians, large, bred for exactly this purpose, erupted into alarm. Deep, sustained barking that echoed off the rock faces and should have turned back any cautious predator. In previous years, with younger or less confident bears, this wall of sound had been enough. But a habituated animal does not respond to noise the way a wild one does. The bear had encountered these dogs before. It had learned their reach, their limits, the length of their courage. It did not slow. Whether it circled wide to avoid them or simply pressed through their defense, the result was the same. The dogs could not hold the line. The shepherd heard the commotion and rose from whatever rest he had managed. He moved toward the fence line carrying a staff and possibly a knife, the only tools available to him. This was not recklessness. This was a confrontation tactic rooted in generations of highland practice, a method that had worked in previous seasons against smaller or more cautious animals. You stand tall, you shout, you strike the ground. You make yourself large and loud and aggressive, and the bear, weighing its options, decides the meal is not worth the fight. That calculus had saved him before. But the animal at his fence that night was not weighing options. It was a dominant male that had fed from this enclosure repeatedly without consequence. It had learned that the sheepfold was a food source, not a boundary. And when the shepherd stepped forward to drive it off, the bear did not retreat. It charged. The distance between them closed in seconds. A brown bear at full sprint covers ground at nearly 40 kilometers per hour, faster than any human can react, faster than a staff can be raised to any meaningful effect. The shepherd had no time to withdraw, no structure to shelter behind, no weapon capable of stopping 250 kilograms of committed predator. Forensic examination of the scene reconstructed what followed. Claw lacerations across the body. The position of the shepherd's remains relative to the enclosure fence indicated he had been struck and brought down within meters of where he made his stand. Sheep had scattered in panic across the surrounding slope. The physical evidence pointed to a single mauling sequence. Not a prolonged struggle, not a series of encounters, but one concentrated, overwhelming assault. The injuries told the rest. Massive trauma to the upper torso and neck, consistent with the crushing bite force and raking claws of an adult male brown bear at close range. The attack was swift, it was decisive, and it was survivable by no measure available to a man alone on a mountain at night. He bled out on the ground beside his own enclosure, in the dark, with no help coming. At first light, a neighboring herder made his way along the ridge toward the sheepfold. He found the shepherd's body near the fence. The dogs were alive but scattered. The flock was broken apart across the hillside, and the bear was gone. It had fed on several sheep before withdrawing into the tree line, retreating back above the mist line as dawn crept across the valley, leaving behind a scene of absolute stillness. The shepherd was dead. The bear had withdrawn into the forest, and across Romania, this was not an isolated event. It was one incident in a year that recorded over 500 bear-human encounters, a number that forces a question no one in power has been willing to answer. One shepherd dead, his flock scattered, his sheepfold empty, and a 250-kilogram brown bear back in the tree line. But this story does not end at a single enclosure in Harghita or Covasna County. It widens to a systemic crisis playing out across Romania's mountains. In a single recent year, Romania recorded over 500 bear-human incidents. Not all of them involved shepherds. Hikers were mauled on marked trails in the Bucegi Range. Foragers gathering mushrooms and berries, the same wild food sources the bears themselves depend on, were charged in forest clearings. Agricultural workers were attacked within sight of their own villages. 500 incidents. That number does not count livestock killed or livelihoods quietly destroyed. It counts only the moments when a human body met claws and teeth. Conservationists point to a conclusion that is difficult but necessary to hear. The bear population has exceeded carrying capacity without adequate corridor management. 8,000 bears compressed into habitat that shrinks with every hectare logged, every road cut through a migration route, every beach stand that fails to produce mast. The animals are not behaving abnormally. They are responding to pressure, the same pressure that drove one adult male to return, night after night, to a sheepfold where it knew food waited behind a wooden fence. The bears did not choose to live alongside people. The shrinking forest gave them no alternative. But stand in a mountain commune and listen to the people who actually share that landscape, and you hear a different emphasis. Rural communities across the Carpathians accuse Bucharest lawmakers of valuing EU biodiversity targets over mountain livelihoods. They see a parliament that signed international conservation agreements in Brussels and then left the enforcement and the consequences to shepherds armed with staves, to farmers who find calves torn apart at dawn, to families who no longer let their children walk to school along forest roads. Protection for the bear, they say, has become abandonment of the people. The political deadlock is nearly perfect in its paralysis. Emergency culling quotas have been proposed in Parliament, debated, revised, stalled. International NGOs file counterpetitions, warning that any cull sets a precedent that could unravel decades of conservation progress across Europe. Environmental agencies defer to Brussels. Municipal authorities defer to Bucharest. Bucharest defers to the next election cycle. And in the gap between proposal and action, a shepherd filed a report about a predator raiding his flock. He followed the system. He identified the animal, described its behavior, requested intervention. Under Romania's protected species legislation, no removal permit was issued in time. That unanswered permit is the emblem of this failure. Not malice, not indifference exactly. Something worse. A bureaucratic architecture so tangled in competing obligations that it cannot respond to a man standing on a mountain telling it, plainly, that a dangerous animal will return tonight. The shepherd did what the system asked him to do. The system did not do what it was built to do. And the predator did what predators do. It would be dishonest to pretend the solution is simple. Blanket culling does not address why the bears are leaving the forest in the first place. Blanket protection does not acknowledge that 8,000 large predators cannot occupy fragmented corridors without lethal conflict. The root pressures,
Deforestation, habitat fragmentation, declining natural food sources from poor mast years, and illegal logging sit beneath the debate like bedrock, and neither side of the political argument has proposed a credible plan to address them. To protect the bear without restoring its habitat is to guarantee more encounters. To cull without reform is to kill animals for a crisis humans created. And so the camera returns to where this began.
The sheepfold above the valley. It stands unmanned now. The flock has been dispersed, sold, redistributed, absorbed into other herds lower on the mountain. The wooden fence still bears the marks of that night. No one has repaired it. No one has moved in to take over the grazing rights. The alpine pasture that sustained a family's livelihood for decades sits open to the weather and the silence. This is the cost, rendered in its quietest form, not the violence of the attack, not the volume of the political argument, just an empty enclosure on a ridge where mist gathers in the early morning and a man no longer stands to watch his animals graze. The bear is still in the tree line, the policy is still deadlocked, and the mountains still need shepherds.